Alright, so in today's video we're going to be taking a look at this new radio by Radiomaster called the GX15. And the version I have here today is the Max version, which has a carbon fiber skin, upgraded gimbals with LEDs and anodized metal buttons. But I should point out there is also a standard version of the radio available too, which is a little bit cheaper and a little bit less premium. But that version does come in a variety of more vibrant color options, which some of you may prefer. Now this radio is a little bit different to anything that Radiomaster has made before, because rather than being designed to be just another generic transmitter, they've actually specifically designed this GX15 with fixed wing and helicopter pilots in mind, and especially those who fly line of sight. Now that's not to say this radio can't still be used with quadcopters or cars or boats, etc., because it absolutely can. But what it does mean is that this radio does feature a few interesting design choices, which some of you may love and some of you may hate. So at first glance, this radio looks quite similar to some of Radiomaster's other existing radios. It clearly shares some similar design features with the TX15 and also the TX16S, for example. But there are some new design features not seen before as well. For example, this is the first radio that Radiomaster has made that doesn't have a scroll wheel, but instead has a rotary wheel instead. And it's also the first radio that has a D-pad for navigating through menu pages rather than 4 separate buttons. Now those are two interesting new design changes that break from Radiomaster's previous design philosophy, but most other things though are done in the more traditional way. So as we can see on the shoulder we have 8 switches. There are 4 on each side. Now 6 of these are 3-position switches, but on the far left we then have a 2-position switch, which would be good for arming. And then on the far right we then have a spring-loaded momentary switch. Now you do have the option to change some of these switches if you want to, because the radio does come with replaceable shoulder panels, as is becoming common with many of Radiomaster's radios these days. Now on the front of the radio we then have 6 programmable buttons that can be configured in a variety of ways, and these also have programmable LEDs in them. And under those we then have 2 rotary knobs. The gimbals are Radiomaster's prized AGO2 gimbals, which are CNC machined and feature Hall effect sensors. And around them there are programmable LED rings, although I'm not sure if these are standard on the GX15 MAX or whether they've just been included on mine because mine is a review sample. Now moving to the back of the radio, we then see that we have 2 sliders, one on each side, and we also have a full-size JR module bay should you ever want to attach additional modules. There's then also a folding handle, removable leather grips, a single USB port which is for charging and PC connectivity, a trainer port and a headphone port, air intakes for the internal cooling fan because there is obviously one of those, and then at the bottom we have a battery compartment. And this radio doesn't come with batteries, but it can take either 2 18650s, and you do get the little battery tray for that, or alternatively it can take a 2S LiPo. And whichever battery configuration you choose, you can charge the battery whilst it's inside the radio via that USB-C port. Now I should also mention that in the battery compartment we find a SD card slot, although you don't have to use the SD card if you don't want to, because this radio actually does have 4 GB of built-in internal memory. And I should also mention that this radio uses the STM32H750 processor, meaning it has the exact same computational power as the flagship Radiomaster TX16S Mark III. Now in terms of size, the GX15 is fairly average. It's certainly considerably bigger than my Pocket or GX12, although they are quite small radios. And it is a little bit bigger than a Boxer or TX15, but it's not quite as big as the TX16S. Now it is a little bit weighty. It's coming in at almost 800 grams when you've got a battery installed, but that's a perfectly comfortable weight, and in general the radio is perfectly comfortable size, which fits in the hands naturally and quite comfortably. Now that was an overview of many of the generic specs and features of this radio, but there's a few other things I've neglected to mention yet, and these are things which are tailored more to the radio specific target audience of line of sight pilots. There's 4 things I want to focus on in a bit more detail, and the first one of those is going to be the screen. So this is a 3.5-inch IPS touchscreen, exactly the same as the one found in the TX15. It has a resolution of 480 by 320, can do 262,000 colours, and has 600 nits of illumination, which actually make it really good at being viewable in bright sunlight. It's a nice screen, but it's not really anything remarkable. But what is interesting about it is its placement. As you can see, it's positioned at the top of the radio, which is historically something that Radiomaster have only ever done on their cheaper radios with the monochrome screens, and it's something that we've never seen them do on their more premium Max radios before. Now, at first I assumed this was because the GX15 was taking design inspiration from its predecessor, the GX12, and maybe it is to some degree, but Radiomaster are saying that actually the main reason for the upper screen positioning is to enable unrestricted viewing of on-screen telemetry. Now, unlike FPV pilots who typically rely solely on their in-goggle OSDs for telemetry information, line-of-sight pilots instead often have to get that information directly from their transmitter screens instead, often through things like widgets or telemetry scripts. Now, Radiomaster recognizes that, when the screen is positioned at the bottom underneath the gimbals, the pilot's arms and sometimes their lanyards can obscure the view of the screen. So that is their primary reason for placing the screen on the GX15 at the top, to make sure you get a completely unrestricted view. Now, the second interesting design choice that Radiomaster has implemented on this radio is found on the inside. All Radiomaster radios run ELRS, and as such they all feature a ELRS transmission module at their heart. And some of their radios, such as the flagship TX16S Mark III, feature a more advanced version of ELRS. They have the Gemini ELRS modules, which are basically two modules in one that each broadcast on different frequencies to ensure really solid control links. Now, the way that optimally this would work is that one of those modules would transmit on 2.4 GHz and then the other module would transmit on 900 MHz. But the GX15 here is doing things a little bit differently. At the heart of the radio, there is a Gemini ELRS module, but rather than transmit on two different frequencies, they instead both transmit on 2.4 GHz. There's no 900 MHz option. Now, Radiomaster's rationale for doing this again goes back to telemetry. When configuring ELRS on your radio, there are many variables that you can customize, and one of those is the packet rate, which is basically how quickly data can be sent between the transmitter and the receiver and back again. Now, if you want the absolute fastest real-time telemetry you can get, then you want to use the F1000 option, which is basically 1000 updates per second. But for reasons that are complicated to explain, that option only works when transmitting on 2.4 GHz and does not work on 900 MHz. So it's for that reason that Radiomaster has locked the GX15 on 2.4 GHz. Now, this isn't a bad thing. Having dual band Gemini on 2.4 GHz is still vastly better than having no Gemini at all. But I can appreciate that some people might be disappointed with this design decision and that they might prefer to have dual band with 900 MHz as an option rather than having super fast telemetry. Now, the third interesting design choice on the GX15 is again related to the ELRS module in the radio, but this time it's in regards to the transmission power. Many of Radiomaster's radios these days allow for up to 1 watt of transmission power, which is obviously great for those that want to fly far or fly behind buildings and trees, etc. But the GX15 is capped at just 250 milliwatts. Now, for a radio of this size, this is a little unusual because the power output is usually proportional to the radio size, and bigger radios tend to have more powerful amplifiers because there's physically plenty of room inside to include them. On the GX15 though, that lower power output is nothing to do with side restraints, and instead it's a deliberate choice by the engineers at Radiomaster. Now, they provide two explanations for this. Firstly, they point out that anyone flying line of sight really isn't likely to need more than 250 milliwatts, which to be fair is probably true. And then secondly, they argue that a lot of pilots who fly line of sight tend to do so whilst flying at model flying clubs or at flying events with other pilots around. So by keeping the transmit power low, it avoids causing conflict with other pilots' radios. Now, personally, I'm not fazed about this 250 milliwatt limit because I've been flying with a Radiomaster Pocket for the last 2 years, which has the exact same power output limit, and I've never struggled with range or penetration at all. I find 250 milliwatts works just fine for my casual flying style, but I can appreciate that, again, this is a design decision by Radiomaster that some people might find controversial. And that now brings me on to the fourth and final interesting design choice on the GX15, which again, people may find controversial, and that's the fact that there are no external antennas. Instead, the antennas are concealed inside the case of the radio, somewhere near the screen, and there are two of them. One of them is orientated horizontally, and the other is orientated vertically. Now again, Radiomaster are rationalizing this by pointing out that pilots flying line of sight don't tend to fly very far, and therefore they don't need an antenna which is providing absolute peak performance. But actually, I wonder if the lack of external antennas is more to do with the fact that the screen is in a way, prohibiting the placement of their traditional rotating antenna. Anyway, now that I've explained all the specs and features of the GX15, let me now talk to you about my experience of actually using it. And the first thing I want to talk to you about is ergonomics. Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, for the past 2 years, I've been flying with a Radiomaster Pocket, which is a very small radio. So for me, the GX15 feels huge. Now, it's not actually big at all. It's a very standard size radio, but maybe I have very small hands because I do struggle to reach some of the switches when holding it naturally, especially switches SB and SC. All the other switches though, and the ones that I've set up for arming, flight modes and turn at home, I am able to reach those easily. And in general, I do find the radio comfortable to hold. I do also find that the sliders on the back are well positioned and easy to reach. But one thing I do not like about them though is they're actually a little bit sharp and a little bit pointy. They do kind of dig into my fingers. Navigating the menus is actually really nice, whether done via the touchscreen or via the buttons. Both methods work really well. And actually one thing I do really like is that new rotary wheel that I mentioned at the beginning, because what it allows you to do is you can now scroll through the menus in one continuous finger motion rather than having to keep swiping on a scroll wheel like you do with any of Radiomaster's other radios. Now when it came to actually using the radio to fly, I found it very pleasant and also very useful. So funnily enough, I actually had an incident just a couple of weeks ago, before the GX15 arrived in my hands, where I was flying one of my fixed-wing planes, FPV, and then suddenly my goggles died mid-flight, and that meant I had to do an emergency line-of-sight landing, which is something that I'd never done before. Now, luckily, on that occasion, I was able to do it successfully without damaging the aircraft, but that made me realise that I needed to get some line-of-sight practice. So over the last couple of weeks, I have actually been doing that. I've been practicing line of sight, and for those early flights, I was using my GX12. But one thing I struggled with was the lack of OSD. Because I've been flying FPV for over 13 years now, I've come to rely on my OSD as a means of getting crucial flight information, such as voltage and altitude, etc. And I never once considered setting up like telemetry alerts or widgets or anything like that on my radio. Now, when the GX15 arrived, all of that changed. This gave me the excuse to learn something new, and I taught myself how to set up widgets on the radio, and then I taught myself how to set up Lua scripts. And that is where the GX15 really shines. I ended up setting up the Yapu telemetry script on my radio, and this shows you all the key information that you would usually get through your FPV OSD. And it was extremely useful to me to be able to glance down at this periodically and just see things such as battery voltage and altitude, etc. whilst flying line of sight. Now obviously you could set up the same Lua script on a whole load of different Radiomaster radios. The GX15 doesn't have any special ability in that regard. But I will admit, I did actually see the benefit to having that top mounted screen, because what it allowed me to do was to quickly glance down at the radio and then get my eyes back up to the aircraft. I didn't have to look all the way down to see the screen. And this was very, very helpful for me, because as someone who's new to flying line of sight, taking my eyes off the aircraft for even a second felt extremely scary. So yeah, I benefited from having the screen higher up. Didn't have to look fully down to be able to see it. And on the note of that screen, one thing I want to mention is it legitimately is really bright and easy to see, even extremely bright sunlight. I was very, very impressed with that. And another thing I just want to mention as well is that actually the speaker on the GX15 is actually surprisingly loud. In addition to having information displayed on the screen, the Yapu script also reads out information to you, and you can really clearly hear it, even over background noise with this speaker. So that was actually really quite impressive.
Battery level 2 alert.
Now I know some people are going to be concerned about some of the GX15's features, such as those internal antennas or that restricted 250 milliwatt power output. So I did do some testing with the radio whilst flying a fixed wing just a little bit further whilst doing FPV, just to see how the radio handled. And what I can report is I had absolutely no issues at all. I was easily able to fly it to a kilometre on several occasions with no signal loss or fail-safing or any kind of alerts, and I even managed to do it on a couple of occasions whilst the aircraft was completely behind myself as well, meaning the signal was blocked by my body. I also used the radio to fly a quadcopter around a load of trees, meaning the signal was frequently being partially blocked, but again I had no issues. So whilst this radio will obviously be no good for those of you that want to fly super long range or go behind big buildings or mountains, etc., it is still an absolutely perfectly capable radio for general everyday casual flying. And just because it's optimized for line of sight pilots, that doesn't mean it can't be used by FPV pilots as well. So yeah, ultimately I found I got on with the GX15 quite well, and ultimately I found it to be a very nice radio. I think it's quite good looking, and it feels solidly built and a durable bit of kit, and the specs are actually reasonably impressive. In some ways, I see it as being the spiritual successor to the GX12. I mean, it's impossible to not see the design similarities there. But I also see it as a radio that somewhat bridges the gap between the TX15 and the TX16S Mark III. It's obviously not quite as good as the flagship, but in most ways it's certainly better than the TX15, with the exception of maybe just that lower power output, because that does kind of mess up that analogy just a little bit. But for me though, those things aren't issues, and as I said, during my testing, neither of those features caused me any issues. So ultimately, I think if you're a bit of a park flyer like me, just a bit of a casual flyer, you'll probably enjoy the GX15 just fine. Now I know that a lot of YouTubers like to say things like, this radio is going to be my new daily driver, but for me, that's not the case. It is a lovely radio, and it does feel very premium, and it's got great specs and great performance. But for me personally, it is a little bit big. That said though, I will be keeping the radio because whilst it won't be my daily go-to, I can still see it being useful with some of my bigger aircraft and certainly a lot of my future projects. So yeah, that is my review of the new GX15 MAX radio by Radiomaster. It's ultimately, I think it's a very nice radio, and I don't really have any major criticism of it. I think it works very well. I hope you've enjoyed watching this review, and if you have, please do consider giving it a like down below because it is generally helpful in keeping the YouTube algorithm happy. And on that note, I guess I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers guys, bye.